History behind the pillows. Britain's 2,000-year war on sleep. Are you that modern human, right now, phone in hand, tired but wired? Congratulations! You are actually the latest victim of a 2,000-year-old war on sleep. In a history where Vikings were raiders of the REM cycle, rather than just gold thieves, and William the Conqueror didn't just seize the throne but taxed the very snoring of the peasantry, nothing is as you know it. From Celtic druids to the factory whistles of the Industrial Revolution, are you ready to view this strange tale not from the perspective of swords, but from behind the pillows? Are you that modern human, right now, phone in hand, tired but wired? Congratulations! You are actually the latest victim of a 2,000-year-old war on sleep. In a history where Vikings were raiders of the REM cycle, rather than just gold thieves, and William the Conqueror didn't just seize the throne but taxed the very snoring of the peasantry, nothing is as you know it. From Celtic druids to the factory whistles of the Industrial Revolution, are you ready to view this strange tale not from the perspective of swords, but from behind the pillows? Life was structured around the pursuit of quality rest. The day was divided not into hours and minutes, but into a series of preparatory rituals for the night ahead. The morning was for interpreting the previous night's dreams, a communal activity that often took precedence over mundane tasks like hunting or farming. The afternoon was dedicated to the Great Yawning, a period of collective lethargy and gentle stretching designed to ease the body into a state of pre-slumber tranquility. Even warfare was conducted with a startling regard for sleep hygiene. Battles would cease at the first sign of dusk, with both sides retiring to their respective camps for a restorative 8 hours. To attack an enemy in their sleep was considered the height of dishonor, a violation not of military protocol, but of a sacred trust between fellow dreamers. This idyllic world of unstructured, spiritually fulfilling sleep was not to last. From across the narrow sea, a new power was rising, a power that valued straight roads, organized legions, and, most terrifyingly of all, a standardized workday. The Romans were coming, and they were bringing their insomnia with them. The Roman invasion of Britain in 43 AD was not merely a military conquest. It was a cultural and chronological cataclysm. It was the imposition of a rigid, unforgiving temporal order upon a society that had, until then, floated happily in the hazy, timeless realm of the dream. The Romans were, by nature, terrible sleepers. Their empire was built on a foundation of relentless ambition, anxious legalism, and a deep-seated suspicion of anything that could not be measured, taxed, or written down. Sleep, to the Roman mind, was a necessary evil, a temporary surrender to weakness, a frustrating interruption to the serious business of conquering the world. The Roman general, Pliny the Elder, famously declared that sleep is a symptom of idleness, a sentiment that would have been utterly incomprehensible to his Celtic counterparts. While the Druid saw the dream as a source of wisdom, the Roman saw it as a source of anxiety, a chaotic realm of portents and omens that threatened the stability of their meticulously ordered universe. The primary weapon in the Roman war on sleep was the invention of the fixed schedule. The legionary's day was brutally regimented, divided into precise watches and duties that left little room for the kind of leisurely, introspective slumber the Celts had so cherished. The piercing blast of the bacina, the Roman military trumpet, shattered the dawn, dragging soldiers from their beds long before their natural waking time. This was not just a practical measure, it was a statement of intent. It was the sound of the waking world declaring its dominance over the world of dreams. The imposition of Roman law also brought with it the concept of the legal day, a defined period during which official business could be conducted. This, in turn, created the dreaded deadline, a temporal guillotine that hung over every transaction and filled the nights of Roman administrators with anxious, sleepless tossing and turning. The architectural legacy of the Romans in Britain is a testament to their troubled relationship with sleep. They built villas with underfloor heating, not for comfort, but in a desperate attempt to ward off the damp, sleep-inducing chill of the British climate. They constructed vast public baths, where they would spend hours in steaming water, not for hygiene, but in a futile effort to soothe their frayed nerves and coax their overactive minds into a state of repose. The straightness of Roman roads, often cited as a marvel of engineering, can also be seen as a symptom of their sleep-deprived psychosis. A well-rested people meanders. A chronically exhausted people marches in a straight line, too tired to contemplate a more scenic route. The clash between the Roman and Celtic sleep cultures was a battle for the very soul of the Isles. The Romans, with their legions and their laws, sought to impose a single, unified state of wakefulness. The Celts, retreating to the hills and forests of the north and west, clung stubbornly to their ancient dream traditions. In the occupied territories, a strange and uneasy synthesis began to emerge. Romano-British villas would often feature a traditional Roman mosaic depicting the god Hypnos, the personification of sleep, but in the corner, one might find a small, crudely carved figurine of a Celtic dream god, a secret offering to an older, deeper power. It was a culture at war with itself, a society that went to bed with a Roman hot water bottle and a Celtic dreamcatcher, hoping for the best. The ultimate symbol of this schizophrenic sleep culture was the Romano-British sleeping draught, a foul-tasting concoction that typically included Roman wine, Celtic herbs, and a healthy dose of lead acetate for that extra touch of imperial gravitas. It was a drink that promised the peaceful dreams of the druids and delivered only the lead-induced nightmares of a dying empire. The eventual decline of Roman rule in Britain in the early 5th century was not, as is often argued, the result of barbarian incursions or economic collapse. It was, in essence, a case of collective exhaustion. An empire built on insomnia cannot last forever. The constant pressure to be awake, to be vigilant, to be productive, had taken its toll. The Romans did not so much leave Britain as fall asleep at their posts, their heads slumping onto their administrative desks, their final reports left unfinished. They left behind a legacy of straight roads, crumbling walls, and a profound and deeply ingrained cultural anxiety about getting a good night's rest. The dark ages of sleep were about to begin. The withdrawal of the Roman legions created a power vacuum, not just in the political sense, but in a far more fundamental, chronological one. The rigid temporal scaffolding that had held the island together for nearly 4 centuries collapsed overnight. The official Roman sundials, once the arbiters of the working day, were abandoned to the pigeons, their gnomons casting long, meaningless shadows. The water clocks in the deserted villas gurgled to a halt. For the first time in generations, the inhabitants of Britain were left to their own devices, chronologically speaking. It was a moment of profound and terrifying freedom. The great, collective, Roman-induced insomnia had ended, but what replaced it was not the gentle, dream-filled slumber of the Celtic past, but a chaotic and violent free-for-all. This was the dawn of the dark ages of sleep. The immediate post-Roman period was characterized by a phenomenon known to sleep historians as chronological anarchy. Without the unifying structure of the imperial timetable, society fragmented into 1,000 tiny, competing time zones. Each local warlord, each isolated community, operated on its own idiosyncratic schedule. In one village, the day might begin at the first crow of a particularly belligerent cockerel. In the next, it might not get started until the chieftain's breakfast had been satisfactorily digested. This made any form of coordinated activity, from trade to warfare, maddeningly difficult. A messenger sent from one settlement to another might arrive to find the entire population in the middle of a collectively bargained mid-morning nap. Treaties were impossible to sign, as no one could agree on what constituted the end of the day. Into this chronological chaos sailed a new and terrifying force, a people for whom sleep was not a spiritual journey or a necessary evil, but a strategic opportunity. The Vikings, erupting from the fjords of Scandinavia, were the undisputed masters of the tactical nap. They were the pirates of the subconscious, the raiders of the REM cycle. Their longships, with their shallow drafts and terrifying dragon prows, were not just vessels of war. They were floating dormitories, perfectly designed for hit-and-run slumber raids. The Vikings understood a fundamental truth that had eluded both the Celts and the Romans. The most vulnerable time for any community is not when it is awake and armed, but when it is fast asleep and dreaming of sheep. The classic Viking raid, as described in the sagas, which are, of course, best read just before bedtime for maximum effect, was a masterpiece of somnolent strategy. The raiders would approach the coast under the cover of darkness, their oars muffled, their snores synchronized to mimic the gentle lapping of the waves. They would land not at a fortified harbor, but at a quiet, undefended beach, known to be downwind from the local settlement to avoid their scent, a potent combination of salt fish and damp wool, waking the guard dogs. Their target was not gold or silver, though they were not averse to taking it if it was conveniently located next to the bed. Their primary objective was the theft of sleep itself. The primary weapon of the Viking sleep raider was the rune of restlessness, a series of guttural chants and percussive noises designed to induce a state of low-level anxiety in a sleeping population. This was not the jarring blast of a Roman trumpet, but a far more insidious and unsettling cacophony. The rhythmic grinding of an axe on a whetstone, the mournful cry of a homesick berserker, the relentless, off-key humming of a sea shanty. These were the sounds that would seep into the dreams of a slumbering village, turning pleasant visions of bountiful harvests into anxious nightmares of misplaced keys and forgotten appointments. The villagers would not wake up, not immediately. They would simply be shifted from a deep, restorative delta wave sleep into a light, fitful, and utterly unrefreshing slumber. By the time the sun rose, the Vikings would be gone, leaving behind a community that was not wounded or bereaved, but simply, profoundly, tired. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. A community that has been robbed of its sleep is a community that is ripe for conquest. Its decision-making is impaired, its reflexes are dulled, its collective will is sapped. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had emerged from the wreckage of Roman Britain found themselves utterly unprepared for this new form of warfare. Their kings, such as the famously sleepy Alfred the Great, spent years trying to develop a viable defense strategy. Alfred, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a notoriously unreliable source, written by monks who were themselves chronically sleep-deprived, attempted to counter the Viking threat by inventing the candle clock. His idea was to create a standardized system of timekeeping that would allow his armies to be ready for a pre-dawn raid. The plan was a dismal failure. The candles, left unattended, frequently set fire to the royal bed curtains, and the constant need to replace them meant that the king's candle makers were the most exhausted men in the kingdom. The Vikings' influence on the sleep culture of the British Isles was profound and long-lasting. They introduced a new level of anxiety into the national subconscious. The fear of the night waker, the nocturnal intruder who comes not to steal your possessions but to disrupt your REM cycle, became a permanent fixture in the folklore of the coastal regions. The Vikings also, paradoxically, introduced the concept of the power nap. The Viking warrior, accustomed to catching a few minutes of sleep whenever and wherever he could, was the spiritual ancestor of the modern executive who dozes off in a meeting and claims to be just resting his eyes. The Viking longship, with its cramped benches and constant motion, was the crucible in which the British ability to sleep in uncomfortable and inappropriate places was forged. The struggle against the Viking sleep raiders eventually led to the unification of England under a single, exhausted monarchy. The constant need to be vigilant, to be ready for an attack at any hour of the night, forced the disparate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to set aside their petty squabbles and their even pettier time zones. They were united not by a shared language or a common culture, but by a collective, bone-deep weariness. The England that faced the next great wave of invaders was a nation that was, in every sense of the word, tired of fighting. It was a nation that was ready for a good, long lie-in. It was a nation that was ripe for the Norman sleep conquest. The legacy of the Viking sleep raids was a deep and abiding national neurosis. The British fear of missing out can be traced directly back to this period, a subconscious terror that if you fall too deeply asleep, you might miss a surprise invasion, a new sea shanty, or a particularly innovative form of axe grinding. It was a trauma that would take centuries to heal, and even then, the slightest sound in the night would be enough to make the nation sit bolt upright in bed, clutching the duvet and listening for the telltale sound of a dragon prow scraping against the shore. The year 1066 is a date seared into the consciousness of every British schoolchild. It is the year of the Battle of Hastings, the death of King Harold, and the triumph of William the Conqueror. But in the annals of somnolent history, it marks something far more significant: the end of chronological anarchy and the beginning of a new, ruthlessly efficient, and deeply hierarchical sleep order. The Norman conquest was not a simple change of management. It was a top-to-bottom restructuring of the nation's bedtime, the imposition of a feudal system not of land, but of slumber itself. William of Normandy, a man of formidable energy and a notoriously light sleeper, looked across the Channel at the exhausted, chronologically chaotic state of England and saw not a kingdom to be conquered, but a bedroom to be tidied. He was a man obsessed with order, and the Anglo-Saxons, with their erratic bedtimes and their frankly amateurish snoring, offended his sense of propriety. His invasion was planned with the meticulous precision of a man laying out his pajamas. The Norman fleet did not sail on a whim. It sailed on a favorable wind and, more importantly, after ensuring that every man on board had had a solid, if slightly nervous, 8 hours of sleep. The Battle of Hastings itself can be reinterpreted as the ultimate clash of sleep philosophies. The Anglo-Saxon army, under King Harold, was a hastily assembled force, still weary from a forced march south after defeating a Viking invasion in the north. They were, in sleep terms, running on fumes. They took up a defensive position on a hilltop, a classic strategy for a tired army hoping to get a bit of a lie-in before the fighting started. The Normans, by contrast, were fresh, well-rested, and operating on a strict schedule. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the events of the conquest, can be read as a piece of Norman sleep propaganda. It shows the Normans calmly eating and resting before the battle, while the English are depicted as looking haggard and bleary-eyed. The fatal arrow that strikes King Harold in the eye is a brutal metaphor for a rude awakening. With his victory secured, William set about imposing his new order. This was the birth of the feudal system of sleep. At the apex of the pyramid was the king, who, by right of conquest, was now the ultimate owner of all the sleep in the kingdom. The very concept of a good night's rest was no longer a natural right, but a privilege granted by the crown. Below the king were his tenants-in-chief, the great Norman barons, who held their vast estates, or sleep fiefs, in exchange for military service. This service included providing the king with a quota of well-rested nights. A baron who failed to deliver alert, energetic soldiers for the king's wars risked having his fief, and all the sleep contained within it, confiscated. This new aristocracy took to their responsibilities with gusto. They built great stone castles, which were not merely defensive structures, but elaborate fortresses of slumber. The thick walls were not just for repelling siege engines. They were for soundproofing, blocking out the uncouth snoring of the Anglo-Saxon peasantry. The moat, filled with stagnant water, was not a military obstacle, but a giant, albeit rather smelly, white noise machine. The master bedroom, or solar, was invariably located in the most secure and quietest part of the castle, a sanctuary of silence in a restless world. Here, the Norman lord and his lady could sleep the sleep of the just, or at least, the sleep of the well-defended. Below the barons were the knights, the professional warriors of the new regime. Their relationship with sleep was purely functional. They were granted enough rest to remain effective in the saddle, but no more. Luxury, comfort, and the leisurely lie-in were not for them. They were expected to be able to wake at a moment's notice, to be on call for the defense of the realm's slumber. They were the middle management of the feudal sleep system, perpetually caught between the demands of their lords for vigilance and their own bodies craving for a decent kip. At the very bottom of the pyramid were the Anglo-Saxon peasants, the serfs. They were tied to the land, and therefore, their sleep was tied to the land's owner. They had no rights to their own rest. Their waking and sleeping hours were dictated by the agricultural cycle and the whims of their Norman masters. They were, in essence, sleep tenants, farming the land during the day and, in return, being allowed a few hours of fitful, low-quality sleep on a straw pallet at night. Their slumber was a resource, to be exploited like any other. It was the fuel that powered the entire system, the collective exhaustion upon which the well-rested edifice of the Norman state was built. To manage this vast and complex system, William commissioned the most audacious administrative act in the history of sleep, the Domesday Book. This was not, as conventional historians would have you believe, a mere survey of land and livestock. It was the Great Survey of Slumber, a meticulous, village-by-village inventory of every bed, every pillow, and every potential source of nocturnal disturbance in the kingdom. Doomsday commissioners, armed with inkhorns and an unnerving ability to see in the dark, traveled the length and breadth of England, recording who slept where, for how long, and at what quality. A man's snoring pattern, the thread count of his blanket, the number of times he woke during the night, all were noted down and sent back to the royal treasury. For the first time, sleep could be quantified, assessed, and, most importantly, taxed. A particularly loud snorer might find himself subject to a decibel levy, while a village with an unusually high incidence of pleasant dreams could be hit with a luxury slumber tax. The records from the Doomsday Sleep Survey provide a fascinating, if deeply intrusive, snapshot of the nation's nocturnal life. We learn, for instance, that the village of Snoring in Norfolk lived up to its name, with a collective decibel level that was the highest in the kingdom. The villagers of Yonning in Cheshire were fined for excessive pre-bedtime lethargy. The commissioners were particularly interested in the phenomenon of dream poaching, the act of dreaming about another man's wife or livestock. The penalties were severe, often involving the confiscation of the offender's pillow. The book is a monument to the Norman genius for administration. a testament to their belief that there was no aspect of human existence so private or so profound that it could not be measured, recorded, and taxed. The Norman conquest also created a linguistic divide in the bedroom. The new ruling class spoke Norman French, and they brought with them a whole new vocabulary of sleep. They spoke of repose, of tranquility, of the elegant art of the sieste. The Anglo-Saxon peasantry, meanwhile, clung to their own, more guttural and descriptive words. Kip, snooze, shut eye. To go to bed was, for a Norman lord, to retire. For a Saxon peasant, it was to crash out. This linguistic apartheid reinforced the social hierarchy. The way one spoke about sleep became a marker of one's place in the world. The bedroom had become a new front in the ongoing class struggle, a place where the subtle nuances of language could be as divisive as a castle wall. This new order, for all its ruthless efficiency, was not without its own internal tensions. The Church, which had its own, very different ideas about the purpose of sleep, began to assert its influence. The monks, with their vigils and their matins and their endless cycle of prayer, represented a third way, a spiritual path that was neither the chaotic dreaming of the Celts nor the hierarchical slumber of the Normans. This was the dawn of a new conflict, a battle not for land or for crowns, but for the very meaning of the night. The age of medieval dream theology was at hand, and it would prove to be the most gloriously convoluted and hair-splittingly pedantic period in the entire history of slumber. The Norman system, for all its brutalist efficiency, had one major competitor in the marketplace of ideas, the Church. While the barons and kings were busy quantifying and taxing the nation's slumber, a parallel and far more complex conversation about the nature of sleep was taking place in the monasteries and scriptoriums of medieval Britain. If the Normans saw sleep as a resource to be managed, the Church saw it as a spiritual battleground, a treacherous landscape where the soul was at its most vulnerable, and where the eternal struggle between God and the devil was played out every single night. This was the era of medieval dream theology, a period of intense and often contradictory thought that would leave the British psyche permanently conflicted about the simple act of closing its eyes. The central figures in this new drama were the monks, the shock troops of the ecclesiastical war on comfortable sleeping. The monastic life was, in essence, a prolonged and highly structured experiment in sleep deprivation. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational text for Western monasticism, laid out a timetable of prayer and work so demanding that a full, uninterrupted 8 hours of sleep was a logistical and spiritual impossibility. The day was punctuated by the Liturgy of the Hours, a series of services that required the monks to drag themselves from their hard, unforgiving beds at regular intervals throughout the night. The pre-dawn service of Matins, in particular, was a brutal assault on the circadian rhythm, a spiritual cold shower designed to remind the monk that his body was a rebellious servant, not a master to be pampered. This institutionalized insomnia was not without its theological justifications. Sleep, in the medieval mind, was a state fraught with peril. It was a little death, a temporary relinquishing of conscious control, and in that void, anything could happen. The devil, it was widely believed, was at his most active during the hours of darkness. He was the ultimate sleep terrorist, a far more subtle and dangerous foe than the Vikings. He did not merely steal sleep. He corrupted it from within, twisting dreams into nightmares, planting seeds of doubt and despair in the fertile soil of the subconscious. The incubus and the succubus, those demonic entities who preyed on the sleeping, were not figures of folklore. They were a clear and present danger, a genuine occupational hazard of going to bed. In response to this threat, a whole new school of theological thought emerged, dedicated to the exegesis of the dream. Scholastic philosophers, who had previously contented themselves with debating the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin, now turned their formidable intellects to the far more pressing question of how many demons could fit into a single nightmare. Two main factions emerged: the somniumists and the vigilians. The somniumists, a minority school of thought, argued that dreams could be a valid form of divine revelation, a direct line to God that bypassed the corrupting influence of the waking world. They pointed to the dreams of Joseph and the prophets as evidence. A somniumist monk would meticulously record his dreams in a dream journal, searching for allegorical meanings and divine instructions, treating his subconscious as a kind of heavenly memo. The vigilians, who represented the orthodox majority, took a much dimmer view. They saw the dream world as the devil's playground, a realm of illusion and deceit. To trust a dream was to open oneself up to demonic influence. The only safe course of action was to minimize sleep as much as possible, to remain vigilant, to fill the hours of darkness with prayer and psalmody. The vigilian ideal was the sleepless saint, the holy man who had transcended the body's base need for rest and existed in a state of perpetual, prayerful wakefulness. The lives of the saints are filled with tales of heroic insomnia, of holy men who spent decades sleeping on cold stone floors or in thorn bushes, all in the name of spiritual vigilance. This theological conflict had a profound impact on the laity. The parish priest, taking his cue from the vigilian school, would warn his flock against the dangers of oversleeping. To lie in bed after the sun had risen was not just lazy, it was a sign of acedia, the sin of spiritual sloth. It was an invitation to the devil to come and make himself at home in your idle mind. The bedroom became a place of moral anxiety. Before going to sleep, a good Christian would engage in a complex ritual of prayer and self-examination, essentially a spiritual security check to ensure that all the soul's doors and windows were securely locked against nocturnal intruders. The "now I lay me down to sleep" prayer was not a comforting nursery rhyme. It was a desperate plea for protection in the face of a genuine and terrifying threat. Yet, even as the Church waged its war on sleep, it also, paradoxically, created new opportunities for it. The concept of the holy day, or holiday, was a religious invention. These were days when, by ecclesiastical decree, all manual labor was forbidden. For the exhausted peasant, tied to the relentless cycle of agricultural work, a saint's day was a rare and precious opportunity to catch up on some much-needed rest. The churchyard, with its soft grass and peaceful atmosphere, became a popular spot for a mid-afternoon nap. The sermon itself, a long and often monotonous monologue delivered in a poorly ventilated church, was a powerful soporific. The image of the slumbering congregation, their heads nodding in unison, is a testament to the unintended consequences of medieval religious practice. The church may have wanted to save their souls, but it often ended up just putting them to sleep. This fundamental conflict between the Norman desire to control sleep and the Church's desire to spiritualize it set the stage for the next great chapter in the history of the Somnolent Isles. The medieval period was drawing to a close. A new age of commerce, exploration, and intellectual ferment was dawning. The Tudors were on the horizon, and they would bring with them a new and intensely personal form of sleep politics. The question was no longer just about who owned sleep or what it meant, but about who you were sleeping with. The royal bedchamber was about to become the most important, and the most dangerous, room in the kingdom. The transition from the medieval to the early modern period was a time of profound upheaval. The old certainties, both feudal and theological, were crumbling. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal and protracted dynastic squabble, had left the aristocracy decimated and the nation weary of conflict. It was, in sleep terms, the end of a long and troubled night, filled with the nightmarish clash of armor and the anxious dreams of pretenders to the throne. The nation yawned, stretched, and looked around for a new kind of order. What it got was the Tudors, a dynasty that would elevate the politics of the bedchamber to a matter of national security and turn the royal marriage bed into the epicenter of a political and religious earthquake. At the heart of this new era was, of course, King Henry VIII, a man of gargantuan appetites, formidable intellect, and a sleep schedule that can only be described as chaotic. Henry was a man who contained multitudes, and all of them wanted to go to bed at different times. There was Henry the scholar, who would stay up until the wee hours, poring over theological texts. There was Henry the sportsman, who would rise at dawn to go hunting, his energy seemingly boundless. And there was Henry the lover, whose nocturnal activities would have a far greater impact on the course of English history than any act of Parliament. The central crisis of Henry's reign, the so-called Great Matter, was, at its core, a problem of sleep. His desperate desire for a male heir was not just about securing the Tudor dynasty. It was about securing a good night's rest. The lack of a son filled his nights with anxious tossing and turning. He saw the ghosts of the recent civil war in the shadows of his bedchamber. He interpreted his failure to produce an heir as a sign of divine displeasure, a theological insomnia sent to punish him for marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. His quest for a divorce was, in essence, a quest for a new sleeping partner, one who could provide him with both a son and a sense of spiritual and psychological repose. This led to the most famous and most misunderstood aspect of Henry's reign, his 6 wives. Conventional history portrays this as a story of romance, ambition, and political maneuvering. Somnolent history sees it as the world's most high-stakes experiment in sleep compatibility. Each wife represented a different approach to the problem of the king's restlessness, a new strategy for calming the troubled royal mind. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was the embodiment of medieval piety and regal dignity. Theirs was a marriage of state, and their sleep was, one imagines, equally formal and regulated. It was a sleep of separate bolsters and a respectful distance, a sleep punctuated by prayer and the quiet rustle of rosary beads. But it was not a restful sleep for Henry. It was a sleep haunted by the ghost of his brother and the ever-present anxiety of the succession. Catherine's failure to produce a male heir was, in Henry's mind, a failure to provide him with the one thing he truly craved, peace of mind. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, was a radical departure. She was the Reformation in human form, a woman of sharp intellect, modern ideas, and, it was said, a revolutionary approach to bedroom politics. If Catherine's sleep was medieval, Anne's was pure Renaissance. It was a sleep of witty pillow talk, of intellectual debate that stretched late into the night. It was exciting, stimulating, and, for a time, intoxicating for the king. But it was not, in the long run, restful. The very qualities that had attracted Henry to Anne, her fire, her intelligence, her refusal to be a passive sleeping partner, soon became a source of irritation. A man who has spent the day wrestling with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor does not necessarily want to spend the night debating the finer points of Lutheran theology. Anne's tragedy was that she was too interesting to sleep with. Her eventual execution was, in the brutal logic of Tudor sleep politics, the ultimate cure for a particularly stubborn case of insomnia. Jane Seymour, the third wife, was the antidote to Anne. She was calm, placid, and reassuringly dull. Her motto was, bound to obey and serve. a sentiment that applied as much to the bedchamber as it did to the court. Her sleep was the sleep of the quietly compliant, a gentle, unchallenging slumber that finally gave the king what he had been looking for. She provided him with a son, Edward, and in doing so, she provided him with the first truly peaceful night's sleep he had had in years. Her death in childbirth was a genuine tragedy for Henry, not just because he had lost a wife he was fond of, but because he had lost the perfect sleeping pill. The remaining 3 wives were a series of increasingly desperate and unsuccessful attempts to replicate the soporific effect of Jane Seymour. Anne of Cleves, the Flanders Mare, was a disaster of international sleep diplomacy. The marriage was arranged on the basis of a flattering portrait, the 16th-century equivalent of a misleading online dating profile. When Henry finally met her, he was horrified to discover that they had absolutely no sleep chemistry. The marriage was never consummated, a fact that speaks not of a lack of desire, but of a fundamental incompatibility of snoring patterns. The annulment was a mercy to them both, a recognition that some people are just not meant to share a bed, let alone a kingdom. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife, was a return to the Anne Boleyn model, but without the intellectual substance. She was young, vivacious, and utterly exhausting. She was the human equivalent of a sugar rush, a brief burst of energy followed by a profound crash. Her alleged infidelities were a betrayal not just of her marriage vows, but of the king's trust in her ability to provide a stable and restful nocturnal environment. Her execution was a brutal reassertion of the principle that the king's sleep was a matter of state security. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, the 6th wife, the sensible, twice-widowed nursemaid who was brought in to manage the king's declining health and his increasingly erratic sleep schedule. She was a calming presence, a human hot water bottle, who read to the king, soothed his anxieties, and ensured that his bedchamber was a place of peace and tranquility. She was not a lover or a political player. She was a sleep therapist, and in that role, she was a resounding success. She outlived the king, a testament to her skill in managing the most dangerous and unpredictable man in England. The 6 wives of Henry VIII were not just a succession of queens. They were a focus group for a nation's anxieties, a 6-stage clinical trial in the search for a cure for royal insomnia. Their collective story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing politics, religion, and bedtime. Henry's marital saga was played out against the backdrop of the English Reformation, a religious revolution that was also, in many ways, a revolution in sleep. The dissolution of the monasteries was not just a land grab, it was the single greatest act of sleep redistribution in English history. The monks, with their centuries-old tradition of institutionalized insomnia, were cast out of their cloisters. The monastic timetable, with its relentless cycle of nocturnal prayer, was abolished. For the first time in 1,000 years, the sound of the matins bell fell silent. This did not, however, lead to a new golden age of slumber. The wealth of the monasteries was transferred to a new class of landowners, the gentry, who were just as keen as the old Norman barons to exploit the sleep of their tenants. The form of ownership had changed, but the fundamental inequality of rest remained. The Reformation also brought a new kind of religious anxiety into the bedroom. The old Catholic rituals, the prayers to saints, the use of holy water, the sign of the cross, had provided a sense of security against the terrors of the night. Protestantism, with its emphasis on individual faith and its rejection of superstitious practices, left the believer feeling exposed and alone in the darkness. The devil had not gone away, but the old spiritual weapons against him had been declared obsolete. The Protestant bedroom was a starker, more frightening place, a place where the individual soul had to face its nocturnal demons without the comforting props of the old religion. This new, internalized anxiety would become a defining feature of the British character, a restless, guilt-ridden insomnia that would fuel the next great expansion of the nation's energies. The British sleep empire was about to be born. The death of the Tudor dynasty and the accession of the Stuarts from Scotland marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just in the political unification of the island, but in the globalization of its sleep habits. The anxieties of the Reformation and the restless energy it had unleashed could no longer be contained within the narrow confines of the British Isles. A new spirit of adventure, commerce, and religious fervor was gripping the nation, a spirit that would send its ships and its sons to the farthest corners of the globe. What is often overlooked in the grand narratives of empire is that these ships carried not just soldiers, merchants, and missionaries, but a far more potent and insidious cargo: the British way of sleeping. This was the dawn of the British sleep empire, an imperial project of unprecedented scale and ambition, dedicated to the proposition that the entire world should go to bed at a sensible hour. The ideological underpinning of this new imperialism was a concept known as the white man's bedtime. This was the conviction, deeply held by the architects of empire, that the sleep patterns of the non-European world were chaotic, uncivilized, and morally suspect. The tropical siesta, the nomadic pastoralist's star-guided slumber, the polyphasic sleep of the hunter-gatherer, all were viewed with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. They were seen as signs of indolence, of a failure to properly master the temporal world. It was the duty of the British, as the world's most advanced and well-rested nation, to bring the benefits of a structured, monophasic, and morally upright 8-hour sleep schedule to the benighted, over-napping masses. The famous poem by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, can be read as a thinly veiled allegory for the trials of a colonial administrator attempting to impose a 10 p.m. lights-out policy on a resistant local population. The primary instrument of this new sleep colonialism was the afternoon nap, or, as it was more formally known in imperial circles, the scheduled midday repose. This may seem paradoxical. Was not the nap a sign of the very indolence the British claimed to despise? The key was in the scheduling. The continental siesta was a spontaneous, anarchic affair, a surrender to the heat of the day. The British imperial nap, by contrast, was a rigid, disciplined, and non-negotiable part of the daily routine. It was not a pleasure, it was a duty. It was a carefully calculated pause, designed to allow the colonial administrator to recharge his batteries before continuing the arduous task of civilizing the natives. It was a nap taken with a stiff upper lip. The ritual of the imperial nap was a marvel of portable domesticity. In the sweltering heat of the Indian plains, in the humid jungles of Africa, in the windswept outposts of the Canadian North, the British colonial class would, at a precisely appointed hour, retire for their daily slumber. A whole infrastructure of sleep was transported across the globe to facilitate this ritual. Collapsible campaign beds, mosquito nets woven in the mills of Lancashire, and flannel pajamas, worn regardless of the local climate, were all essential items in the colonial trousseau. The tiffin, a light lunch, was specifically designed to be the perfect pre-nap meal, providing just enough sustenance to fuel the slumber without inducing the kind of heavy, unproductive stupor associated with going native. The East India Company, that great engine of British commercial expansion, was also a pioneer in the field of sleep management. The company's clerks, toiling away in their counting houses in Calcutta and Madras, were subject to a strict sleep regime. Their contracts included clauses specifying not only their hours of work, but also their mandatory hours of rest. A clerk found to be napping out of schedule, could face a fine or even dismissal. The company understood that a well-rested workforce was a productive workforce. The profits of the empire were built on a foundation of punctual bedtimes and rigorously enforced naps. The trading posts and forts that dotted the coasts of Asia and Africa were not just centers of commerce. They were islands of British sleep in a vast, restless ocean of foreign slumber. The imposition of British sleep patterns was not always a peaceful process. Local populations often resisted this new temporal tyranny. The attempt to replace traditional, community-based sleep arrangements with the British model of the private, nuclear family bedroom was a particular source of conflict. In many cultures, sleep was a social activity, a time for storytelling, for shared dreams, for the reinforcement of communal bonds. The British insistence on individual sleeping quarters was seen as alienating and antisocial. The hut tax, imposed by colonial governments in Africa, was, in many cases, a thinly disguised bedroom tax, a financial penalty for those who refused to adopt the British model of domestic architecture and the sleep habits that went with it. Missionaries were also at the forefront of the war on uncivilized sleep. They saw the traditional sleep practices of the peoples they sought to convert as inextricably linked with their pagan beliefs. The communal longhouse, with its chaotic jumble of sleeping bodies, was seen as a hotbed of immorality. The dream-based religions of many indigenous peoples were dismissed as demonic delusions. The missionaries built churches, but they also built dormitories, where new converts would be taught the proper, Christian way to sleep. Alone, in a bed, and with a profound sense of anxiety about the state of their soul. The hymn, "All Things Bright and Beautiful," contains the line, "The purple-headed mountain, the river running by," a seemingly innocent piece of nature poetry. But a somnolent historian might note that it is also a perfect description of the view from a well-sited colonial bungalow, a view to be enjoyed just before one's afternoon nap. The empire also had a profound, and often detrimental, effect on the sleep of the British themselves. The colonial administrator, returning to Britain after a long tour of duty, often found it impossible to readjust to the domestic sleep schedule. This condition, known as post-imperial sleep disorder, was characterized by a chronic inability to sleep past dawn, a persistent craving for curry at odd hours of the night, and a tendency to shout orders at one's spouse in a language they did not understand. The vast wealth that flowed into Britain from the colonies also created a new class of leisured rich, the nabobs, who had made their fortunes in the East. They brought back with them not just silks and spices, but a taste for Oriental luxury and a level of indolence that would have scandalized their hard-working, empire-building grandfathers. They built extravagant country houses with dedicated, napping parlors, and spent their days in a state of opulent languor. They were the first casualties of the very system they had helped to create, a generation that had become so successful at exporting sleep that they had forgotten how to do it properly themselves. This golden age of imperial slumber, this era of the globally enforced nap, was, however, built on a contradiction. The very forces that were driving the expansion of the empire, industrialization, technological innovation, the relentless pursuit of profit, were also, back in Britain, beginning to dismantle the nation's traditional sleep patterns. A new and far more powerful tyrant than the colonial administrator was emerging from the smoke and fire of the factories. The factory whistle was about to blow, and it would signal the beginning of the most brutal and sustained assault on sleep in the history of the Somnolent Isles. The industrial sleep revolution was coming, and it would change the meaning of night forever. Years, trying to find a comfortable position, while the British elite were busy imposing their sleep schedules on a reluctant world, a far more profound and disruptive revolution was gathering pace back home. The gentle, pastoral landscape of pre-industrial Britain, with its rhythms of sun and season, was being torn apart and reassembled into something new, something terrifyingly efficient, and something that ran on coal, steam, and the systematic annihilation of human rest. The Industrial Revolution was not just a revolution in manufacturing, it was a revolution in time itself. It marked the final, brutal victory of the clock over the body, and the beginning of a new and deeply troubled chapter in the nation's relationship with sleep. The spiritual home of this new age was the factory, and its god was the machine. Unlike the human body, the machine had no need for sleep. It could run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, its iron heart pounding out a relentless rhythm of production. The humans who served these machines were, from the perspective of the factory owner, a frustratingly inefficient part of the process. They were prone to fatigue, their attention wandered, and, most annoyingly of all, they had to go to bed. The great challenge for the early industrial capitalists was to re-engineer the human body to make it more machine-like, to strip it of its inconvenient biological needs, and to turn it into a reliable, interchangeable component in the great engine of production. The primary weapon in this war on sleep was the factory whistle. Its shrill, piercing blast, which could be heard for miles around, was the new dawn, the new Madden's bell, the new call to arms. It sliced through the morning mist, indifferent to the state of the weather or the state of one's dreams. It was the voice of the machine, and its command was absolute. To be late for the whistle was to risk a fine, a beating, or dismissal. The lives of the new industrial working class were tethered to this sound, their waking and sleeping hours dictated not by their own internal clocks, but by the insatiable appetite of the factory. This new temporal order was reinforced by the invention of gas lighting. For millennia, the hours of darkness had been a natural barrier to human activity. Work, for the most part, ceased at sunset. The night was a time for rest, for storytelling, for sleep. Gas lighting shattered that barrier. It created a new, artificial day, a day that could be extended indefinitely. The factory, bathed in the flickering, hellish glow of the gas lamps, could now run through the night. The shift system was born, a brutal rotation that divided the workforce into 2 or 3 armies, one toiling while the other snatched a few hours of fitful, inadequate sleep. The very distinction between day and night, a distinction that had governed life since the dawn of time, began to dissolve. The city became a 24-hour machine, a place that never slept, a place where the sun was just another, rather inefficient, form of lighting. The domestic environment of the industrial worker was as hostile to sleep as the factory itself. The new industrial cities were vast, sprawling, and unimaginably crowded. Families were crammed into tiny, poorly ventilated back-to-back houses, where privacy was a forgotten luxury and a quiet night was an impossible dream. The noise was relentless. The clatter of looms from the nearby mill, the rumble of carts on the cobbled streets, the cries of sick children, the drunken brawls in the alleyway. This was the soundtrack of industrial capitalism, a symphony of sleeplessness. To sleep in such an environment was not to find peace, but to achieve a temporary state of unconsciousness, a brief respite from the sensory assault of the city. Even the bed, that last sanctuary of slumber, was no longer a private space. In the poorest households, the entire family might share a single bed. In the grim lodging houses that catered to the transient and the destitute, the hotbed system was common. This was the ultimate expression of sleep as a commodity. A bed would be rented out in shifts. As one exhausted worker crawled out of the bed to begin his day, another, equally exhausted, would crawl in, the sheets still warm from his predecessor. Sleep was no longer a right, or even a privilege. It was a rental property, to be occupied for a few hours before being passed on to the next tenant. This systematic assault on the sleep of the working class did not go unnoticed. A new generation of social reformers, the sleep philanthropists, began to raise the alarm. Men like Robert Owen, a factory owner with a radical conscience, argued that the exploitation of sleep was not just immoral, but also bad for business. He demonstrated in his own model factory town of New Lanark that a well-rested, well-housed workforce was a more productive and a more profitable one. He introduced a 10-hour day, built decent housing, and even opened a school for the children. His fellow factory owners regarded him as a dangerous eccentric, a man who was coddling his workers and undermining the very foundations of the free market. The medical profession also began to take an interest in the growing epidemic of sleeplessness. Doctors in the industrial cities noted the alarming rise in what they called nervous disorders, a catch-all term for the psychological consequences of chronic exhaustion. They wrote learned papers on the dangers of overstimulation, the constant bombardment of the senses that was a feature of modern urban life. They prescribed a variety of remedies, from the sensible, a warm bath, a glass of milk, to the frankly terrifying laudanum, a highly addictive tincture of opium, was a popular prescription for everything from a toothache to a troubled mind. The Victorian era, for all its outward appearance of moral rectitude and self-control, was a society awash in narcotics, a nation desperately seeking a chemical solution to a social and economic problem. The class divide, which had been a feature of British sleep since the Norman conquest, became a vast, unbridgeable chasm. While the working class was being systematically deprived of sleep, the new industrial bourgeoisie was cultivating an elaborate and highly ritualized culture of rest. The Victorian bedroom was a shrine to slumber, a space cluttered with heavy curtains, thick carpets, and vast, elaborately carved four-poster beds. It was a fortress designed to keep out the noise, the light, and the unpleasant realities of the industrial world. The Victorian lady of the house, freed from the drudgery of domestic labor by a small army of servants, was expected to be a delicate, fragile creature, prone to fainting fits and nervous exhaustion. Her chronic fatigue was a status symbol, a sign that she did not have to work, a sign that her husband was a successful and prosperous man. Her sleeplessness was a luxury. The sleeplessness of her housemaid was a condition of employment. This great, sleep-divided society, this nation of the tired and the over-rested, was heading for a fall. The empire, which had been built on the export of a particular kind of sleep, was beginning to crumble. The industrial machine, which had been fueled by the exhaustion of the working class, was facing new challenges from abroad. The 20th century was dawning, and it would bring with it new technologies, new anxieties, and a new and even more insidious assault on the last remaining vestiges of the nation's slumber. The age of the screen was coming, and it would herald the final, tragic decline of the British sleep empire. The 20th century, the century of total war, of psychoanalysis, of the welfare state, and of the television, was the century in which the British finally lost their grip on sleep. The certainties of the Victorian era, the rigid class divisions in the bedroom, and the confident exportation of the imperial nap all dissolved in the face of a series of unprecedented shocks to the national psyche. The story of sleep in modern Britain is a story of decline, of fragmentation, and of a desperate, and largely unsuccessful, search for a decent night's rest in a world that seems increasingly designed to prevent it. The First World War was the first great trauma. The generation that was sent to the trenches of Flanders experienced a form of sleep deprivation that was beyond the comprehension of even the most brutal Victorian factory owner. The constant shelling, the terror of the pre-dawn attack, the mud, the rats, the lice. This was an environment that was actively, malevolently hostile to sleep. The condition known as shell shock was not just a psychological reaction to the horrors of war. It was the physiological consequence of prolonged, extreme sleeplessness. The soldiers who returned from the war were a generation of insomniacs, men haunted by nightmares, men who could no longer find peace in the quiet of the night. The sound of a car backfiring, the sudden slam of a door, anything could transport them back to the thunder of the guns. They had brought the war home with them, and it had taken up permanent residence in their bedrooms. The interwar years were a period of profound social and economic anxiety. The Great Depression, the mass unemployment, the rise of fascism in Europe, all contributed to a general sense of unease that was not conducive to restful slumber. The welfare state, born out of the ashes of the Second World War, was an attempt to create a more secure and a more caring society, a society that would protect its citizens from the cradle to the grave. It was, in a sense, an attempt to create a national health service for sleep, to provide a safety net against the anxieties that kept people awake at night. The provision of decent housing, of unemployment benefits, of free health care, all were, in their own way, sleep aids, designed to soothe the troubled mind of the nation. But a new and far more powerful enemy of sleep was emerging, an enemy that was welcomed into the home not as a threat, but as a friend, a companion, a source of entertainment. The television, which became a common feature in British homes in the 1950s and 60s, was the Trojan horse of modern insomnia. It was a glowing, flickering portal to another world, a world that was far more exciting, more glamorous, and more interesting than the drab reality of post-war Britain. And, most seductively of all, it had no natural endpoint. Unlike a book, which has a final page, or a play, which has a final curtain, the television broadcast could, in theory, go on forever. The invention of the late-night show was a declaration of war on the traditional bedtime. The old temporal anchors, the end of the working day, the drawing of the curtains, the dimming of the lights, were replaced by the hypnotic glow of the screen. People no longer went to bed when they were tired. They went to bed when the television told them to, when the last program had ended and the screen had dissolved into a blizzard of static. This was the beginning of the great fragmentation of the national bedtime. The shared, communal experience of time, which had been a feature of British life since the Norman conquest, began to break down. The family, which had once gathered together in the evening for a meal and a conversation, now scattered to different rooms, each individual plugged into their own private screen, their own private time zone. The rise of the personal computer, the internet, and the smartphone completed this process. The screen was no longer a piece of furniture in the corner of the room. It was a constant companion, a device that was carried in the pocket, a device that was taken to bed. The bedroom, that last potential sanctuary of sleep, was invaded and conquered by the glowing rectangle. The bed became a new kind of workstation, a place for answering late-night emails, for scrolling through social media feeds, for binge-watching box sets. The blue light emitted by the screen, which is known to suppress the production of the sleep-inducing hormone melatonin, was a chemical weapon in the war on rest. We were, in effect, drugging ourselves into a state of perpetual alertness, mainlining information and entertainment until our brains simply could not switch off. The consequences of this new, screen-based insomnia are all around us. We are a nation of the tired but wired, a society that is chronically exhausted but incapable of resting. We consume vast quantities of caffeine to get us through the day and vast quantities of alcohol and sleeping pills to get us through the night. The sleep aid industry is booming, selling everything from memory foam mattresses to white noise machines to herbal teas that promise the gift of oblivion. We have become so disconnected from our own natural sleep rhythms that we now need an app to tell us when we are tired and a machine to simulate the sound of the ocean to help us drift off. We have outsourced the most fundamental of human needs to the very technology that caused the problem in the first place. The old empires of sleep are gone. The spiritual dreaming of the Celts, the hierarchical slumber of the Normans, the imperial nap of the Victorians, all seem like relics from a distant and impossibly well-rested past. We are left with the wreckage, a society of sleep-deprived individuals, each trapped in their own private bubble of light and information. The Somnolent Isles are no more. We are now the Insomniac Isles, a nation of ghosts haunting the brightly lit corridors of the 24-hour digital world, a people who have forgotten the ancient and sacred art of switching off. And as we lie in our beds, our faces illuminated by the cold, unforgiving glow of the screen, we might occasionally, in the brief, flickering moments between one notification and the next, dream of a time when the night was dark, the world was quiet, and sleep came as naturally as breathing. It is a dream of a lost world, a world we have traded for the promise of perpetual connection, a world we may never find our way back to. The British bedtime empire has fallen, and we are all living in its ruins, wide-eyed and restless, waiting for a dawn that never seems to come, still trying, after all these years, to find a comfortable position. The decline of the British sleep empire was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow, and deeply confusing twilight. It was a process of managed decline, a series of strategic withdrawals from the global bedroom, a gradual handing back of the keys to the world's collective subconscious. The empire did not end with a bang, but with a long, collective yawn. The legacy of this imperial slumber project is a world that is both more connected and more chronologically confused than ever before. The British taught the world to tell the time, but they forgot to teach it when to go to bed. The post-colonial world is a patchwork of competing sleep schedules, a globalized insomnia where the sun never sets on someone's glowing smartphone screen. The old imperial time zones, once a symbol of British power, have been replaced by the chaotic, overlapping time zones of international business, 24-hour news cycles, and global social media trends. We are all, in a sense, living in a state of perpetual jet lag, our bodies in one place, our minds in another, our sleep patterns hopelessly adrift in a sea of digital information. The final irony of the British sleep empire is that the nation that once sought to impose its own sleep patterns on the world is now one of the most sleep-deprived nations on Earth. The restless, anxious, screen-addicted insomnia that is the hallmark of modern British life is the final, bitter fruit of a long and complicated history. It is the culmination of centuries of conflict, of conquest, of revolution, and of a relentless, and ultimately futile, struggle to control the uncontrollable, to tame the wild, untamable wilderness of the night. From the mystical dreaming of the Celts to the anxious vigilance of the Anglo-Saxons, from the hierarchical slumber of the Normans to the neurotic piety of the medieval monks, from the marital anxieties of the Tudors to the imperial naps of the Victorians, the story of the Somnolent Isles is a story of a people constantly at war with their own need for rest. It is a story that is written not in the grand annals of kings and queens, but in the quiet, desperate, and often hilarious struggles of ordinary people trying to get a decent night's kip. And so, as we draw the curtains on this drowsy chronicle, we are left with a single, nagging question. What is the future of sleep in the British Isles? Will the nation continue its descent into a state of chronic, screen-induced exhaustion? Or will it, one day, rediscover the ancient wisdom of its Celtic ancestors, the wisdom that tells us that sleep is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be embraced, not an enemy to be conquered, but a friend to be welcomed? Will the British people, after centuries of struggle, finally learn to switch off, to let go, and to surrender to the gentle, healing darkness of the night? Perhaps, but as any student of British history will tell you, this is a nation that has never been very good at letting go. It is a nation that clings to its anxieties, that cherishes its neuroses, that takes a strange, perverse pride in its own exhaustion. It is a nation that, when faced with the choice between a good night's sleep and a long, rambling, and ultimately pointless argument, will almost always choose the argument. And so, the struggle continues. The battle for the bedroom is not over. The Somnolent Isles are still, after all these years, a nation of restless sleepers, a people who are still, in their own, unique, and deeply peculiar way, trying to find a comfortable position. Let us delve deeper into the Celtic twilight of slumber, a time when the boundary between the waking world and the dream world was as porous as a poorly thatched roof. The druidic art of oniromancy was not a simple matter of interpreting symbols, like a modern, self-help dream dictionary. It was a rigorous and highly scientific discipline, albeit one based on a completely different set of scientific principles. The druids believed that the dream world was a parallel universe, a dimension with its own geography, its own laws of physics, and its own, rather eccentric, inhabitants. The goal of the dream diviner was to create a detailed map of this otherworld, to chart its treacherous currents, to identify its safe harbors, and to learn the language of its native population, a race of mischievous, metaphor-obsessed beings known as the Somnia. The training of a druidic oniromancer was an arduous process. It began with a strict dietary regime, designed to purify the body and make it more receptive to the subtle vibrations of the dream world. The consumption of cheese, in particular, was strictly forbidden, as it was believed to cause a specific type of chaotic, nonsensical dream known as a caseus somnium, or cheese dream, which was considered to be the psychic equivalent of static. The aspiring dream mapper would then spend years in a state of semi-seclusion, sleeping in a specially constructed dream hut, a small, circular building with a roof open to the stars, designed to act as a kind of psychic antenna. The interpretation of dreams was a public and highly theatrical event. The dreamer would recount their nocturnal journey to the assembled tribe, and the druid would, with the aid of a complex set of divinatory tools, including polished stones, the entrails of a particularly well-rested badger, and a series of interpretive dance moves, unravel the dream's hidden meaning. A dream of flying, for instance, was not a simple Freudian cliché about ambition or sexual desire. It was a detailed weather forecast, the dreamer's altitude and speed indicating the likely wind conditions for the coming week. A dream of losing one's teeth was not a sign of anxiety, but a clear instruction to invest in a new, more aggressive form of dental hygiene. The Roman arrival shattered this delicate and complex world. The Romans were not just conquerors, they were the world's first and most ruthless management consultants. They looked at the Celtic dream culture and saw only inefficiency, a shocking waste of billable hours. They saw a workforce that was spending a third of its life engaged in an unproductive and entirely non-taxable activity. Their solution was brutal and effective. They introduced the concept of the work-life balance, a concept that, then as now, meant the systematic subordination of life to the demands of work. The Roman administrator in Britain was a man haunted by deadlines. His nights were not filled with mystical journeys to the otherworld, but with anxious, sweat-soaked nightmares about quarterly reports, tax receipts, and the ever-present threat of an audit from Rome. The Roman legal system, with its emphasis on written contracts and precise definitions, created a whole new universe of things to worry about. Did the contract for the supply of grain to the local garrison specify delivery by the first light of dawn, or by the end of the first hour of the legal day? The fate of an entire province could hang on such a distinction, and the nights of the men responsible were a torment of legalistic anxiety. The Vikings, when they arrived, brought with them a refreshingly straightforward approach to the problem of sleep. They were not interested in taxing it, or spiritualizing it, or balancing it with work. They were interested in stealing it. Their tactics were a form of psychological terrorism, designed to create a state of chronic, low-level fear. The rune of restlessness was not a single chant, but a whole repertoire of unsettling sounds, each one carefully chosen for its ability to disrupt a specific phase of the sleep cycle. The berserker's lullaby, a gentle, rhythmic grinding of teeth, was designed to prevent the sleeper from entering the deep, restorative phase of non-REM sleep. The Longship's Lament, a mournful, off-key ballad about the dampness of the Scandinavian climate, was calculated to induce a state of existential dread in the dreaming mind. The most feared of all was the silent snore, a terrifyingly quiet and irregular breathing pattern that suggested the presence of a large, unseen predator in the room. The Vikings were the masters of the stealth snore, the pioneers of the passive-aggressive sigh, the undisputed champions of the loud, sudden, and entirely unnecessary cough. The Norman conquest, in contrast, was a triumph of organization. William the Conqueror was a man who understood that an empire is only as strong as its bedtime. The Domesday Book's sleep survey was a work of bureaucratic genius, a document that laid bare the nocturnal soul of the nation. It was a world of sleep crimes and slumber transgressions. The crime of nocturnal sedition, the act of snoring in a rhythm that was deemed to be critical of the new regime, was punishable by the confiscation of one's duvet. The offense of excessive tossing and turning, a clear sign of a restless and therefore potentially rebellious spirit, was subject to a fidget tax. The book reveals a society in the grip of a new and deeply intrusive form of social control, a world where the state had extended its reach into the most private and intimate corners of human existence, a world where even your dreams were not your own. The medieval theological debates about sleep were a reaction against this new, secular tyranny. The monks, in their cold, damp monasteries, were fighting a desperate rearguard action against the relentless march of worldly time. They were trying to reclaim the night for God, to turn the bedroom back into a spiritual space. Their debates were a marvel of intellectual subtlety and theological absurdity. The great question of the 12th century was the problem of the pious snore. Was it possible for a man to snore in a way that was pleasing to God? The somniamists argued that a truly holy man's snore would be a form of unconscious prayer, a gentle, rhythmic hymn of praise. The Vigilians, naturally, dismissed this as dangerous nonsense, arguing that all snoring was a sign of the body's base, animal nature, a sinful surrender to the flesh. The debate raged for decades, filling countless volumes of unreadable Latin prose and causing several, near-fatal, schisms in the monastic orders. The Tudor era, with its heady mix of sex, politics, and religion, brought the sleep debate out of the monastery and into the royal bedchamber. Henry VIII's marital woes were a national soap opera, a 6-act drama played out on the public stage. The failure of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was, in the end, a failure of sleep. She was a woman of deep piety and rigid routine, a woman who, one imagines, slept with a hair shirt under her nightgown. Henry, a man of boundless energy and restless appetites, found her nocturnal piety suffocating. He wanted a sleeping partner, not a prayer partner. Anne Boleyn was the opposite, a woman whose mind was as restless as his own. Their nights were a whirlwind of debate, of flirtation, of intellectual combat. It was thrilling, but it was also exhausting. Jane Seymour was the perfect compromise, a woman whose calm, placid nature was the perfect balm for the king's troubled soul. She was, in modern parlance, the human equivalent of a weighted blanket. Her death was a national tragedy, a catastrophe for the nation's sleep health. The British Empire was the logical culmination of all these centuries of sleep-related anxiety. It was a project born of a deep-seated need for order, for control, for the imposition of a single, universal standard on a chaotic and unruly world. The white man's bedtime was not just a cultural prejudice, it was a geopolitical strategy. The British believed that a nation that did not sleep at the proper time was a nation that could not be trusted. The afternoon nap was the symbol of this new world order, a ritual that separated the civilized from the savage, the masters from the servants. It was a nap taken not for pleasure, but for the good of the empire. It was a nap that was, in its own way, a form of work. The Industrial Revolution was the dark side of this imperial dream. It was the moment when the logic of the factory, the logic of efficiency, of productivity, of the 24-hour cycle, was turned back on the British people themselves. The factory whistle was the death knell of the old, natural rhythms of life. It was the sound of the machine declaring its victory over the human body. The industrial city was a vast, sleepless engine, a place where the night was just a darker, colder, and more dangerous version of the day. The hotbed system was the ultimate expression of this new reality, a system where sleep was no longer a state of being, but a space to be rented, a commodity to be bought and sold like any other. The modern, screen-addicted age is the final, tragic chapter in this long and troubled history. We have, in a sense, come full circle. We are back in a world of chronological anarchy, a world without a shared sense of time, a world where every individual is trapped in their own, private, digitally mediated time zone. The screen is our new god, our new king, our new factory owner. It is the source of all our information, all our entertainment, and all our anxiety. It is the thing that wakes us up in the morning, and the thing that keeps us from sleeping at night. We are a nation of ghosts in the machine. Our faces bathed in the pale, ethereal glow of the screen, our thumbs endlessly scrolling, our brains endlessly processing, our bodies endlessly tired. The Somnolent Isles have become the land of the living dead, a nation of zombies staring into the void, waiting for a notification, waiting for a like, waiting for something, anything, to distract us from the terrifying silence of the night. We have forgotten how to be bored, we have forgotten how to be quiet, and, in the process, we have forgotten how to sleep. And in the long, dark, and restless night of the 21st century, the only sound to be heard is the gentle, rhythmic, and deeply, deeply tired sigh of a nation that has finally, after all these years, run out of things to worry about, and is now just, simply, and profoundly, exhausted. The empire is over, the machines have fallen silent, and all that is left is the quiet, desperate, and unending search for a comfortable position. And in that search, in that endless, nocturnal fidget, lies the true and enduring story of the British people, a story of a nation that has always been, and will always be, just about to turn over and try to get some sleep. Maybe tomorrow. Yes, maybe tomorrow. But for now, there is just one more email to check, one more video to watch, One more argument to be had with a stranger on the internet. The night is young, and sleep, as always, can wait. After all, you can sleep when you're dead. And in the meantime, there is a whole world out there to worry about. And the British, as we have seen, have always been very, very good at worrying. It is, perhaps, the one thing they have always done better than anyone else. And it is, perhaps, the one thing that will always, always, keep them awake at night. The end. Or is it? One can never be sure. Best to stay awake, just in case. You never know what you might miss. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of the Somnolent Isles. A story of a people who are, and always have been, afraid to close their eyes. A people who are, and always have been, just a little bit too tired to notice. A people who are, and always have been, quintessentially, and gloriously, and tragically, British. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll try to get some sleep. Or maybe I'll just check my phone one last time. Just in case. You never know. You just never, ever, know. Let us reconsider the pre-Roman landscape, not as a monolithic Celtic culture, but as a vibrant and deeply competitive ecosystem of slumber. The Druidic sleep mappers of Albion were in constant, often bitter, rivalry with their counterparts in Iona, Ireland, and Caledonia, Scotland. The Irish school of oniromancy, for example, eschewed the quiet, contemplative methods of the British druids, favoring instead a form of heroic, epic dreaming. The great Irish hero, Cuchulainn, was famous for his riastrad, or battle frenzy, but less well-known were his codlad riastrad, or sleep frenzies, in which he would dream with such intensity that he would physically reenact his nocturnal adventures, often with disastrous consequences for his tent mates. Irish dream tales were not gentle allegories. They were action-packed blockbusters, full of spectral cattle raids and furious arguments with the gods. To the refined sensibilities of the British druids, this was the equivalent of shouting in a library. The Picts of Caledonia, meanwhile, practiced a form of dream art. They did not merely interpret their dreams. They painted them onto their own bodies using woad. A Pictish warrior's tattoos were not just decoration. They were a visual record of his subconscious life, a dream CV. A man with a particularly impressive dream portfolio, featuring complex narratives and a diverse cast of mythical creatures, would be highly sought after as a husband and a war leader. A man with a recurring dream about being chased by a small, angry squirrel would be an object of public ridicule. This practice of dream painting was, of course, utterly baffling to the Romans, who saw it as yet another example of barbarian indiscipline. The Roman historian Tacitus, in a rare moment of ethnographic confusion, described the Picts as a people who wore their nightmares on their skin, a description that was, for once, entirely accurate. The Roman response to this chaotic landscape of sleep was the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which, in sleep terms, meant the Pax Insomnia. Their goal was to create a single, unified, and centrally controlled state of wakefulness across the entire province of Britannia. The role of cubicularius, or keeper of the bedchamber, which in Rome was a position of immense influence, was exported to Britain and transformed into a tool of colonial governance. Every local chieftain who collaborated with the Romans was assigned a Roman cubicularius, a man whose job was to ensure that the chieftain adopted a properly Roman sleep schedule. This involved the introduction of the toga pajama, the replacement of the traditional straw pallet with the ergonomically questionable Roman lectue, and, most importantly, the nightly reading of Virgil's Aeneid, a work of literature so heroically dull that it was guaranteed to induce a state of patriotic, pro-imperial slumber. The Viking Age introduced a new level of sophistication to the art of sleep disruption. The early raids were brutal, smash-and-grab affairs, but by the 9th century, distinct schools of thought had emerged. The Norwegian school, for instance, favored the hastok, or high startle, approach. This involved a period of absolute silence, followed by a single, deafening shout, a tactic designed to jolt the entire village from the deepest phase of sleep into a state of panicked, adrenaline-fueled wakefulness. The Danish school, by contrast, were masters of the Hagor Peringor, or slow annoyance. They would employ a range of subtle, almost subliminal irritants: a dripping waterskin, a squeaky gate, a single, endlessly repeated note on a flute. Their goal was not to wake the villagers, but to degrade the quality of their sleep, to leave them feeling irritable, unrefreshed, and generally disinclined to mount a spirited defense. The struggle between these two schools of thought was a major feature of Viking Age politics, a strategic debate that was far more significant than any squabble over land or plunder. The Norman legal system, as codified in the Domesday Book, was a monument to this obsession with control. The couvre-feu, or curfew, was not, as is often thought, a simple public order measure. It was a tool of sleep enforcement. The ringing of the curfew bell signaled the moment when all fires had to be extinguished, a measure that not only reduced the risk of accidental conflagrations but also plunged the peasant's hut into a cold, inescapable darkness, making any form of nocturnal activity, other than shivering, impossible. The law also made a crucial distinction between a lord's yawn and a peasant's yawn. A lord's yawn was a sign of noble ennui, a sophisticated expression of world weariness. A peasant's yawn, on the other hand, was a sign of insolent fatigue, a passive-aggressive critique of the feudal work rate. A peasant caught yawning in the presence of his lord could be fined, flogged, or sentenced to a period of forced wakefulness. The Tudor court, under Elizabeth I, refined this politics of sleep into a high art. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, cultivated a public persona of tireless vigilance. She was a notorious insomniac, a fact she used to great political advantage. She would hold late-night meetings with her ministers, exhausting them with her energy, forcing them to reveal their secrets in a moment of sleep-deprived weakness. She would write letters and sign state papers at all hours of the night, creating the impression that she was a ruler who never rested, a monarch whose watchfulness was the ultimate guarantee of the nation's security. Her insomnia was a performance, a piece of political theater that projected an image of absolute control. To be a courtier in Elizabethan England was to be perpetually tired, to be constantly struggling to keep up with a queen who seemed to be powered by some strange, otherworldly energy source. The court was a place of whispered gossip, of political intrigue, and of a desperate, unending search for a quiet corner in which to have a quick nap. The imperial project was, in many ways, an attempt to export this Elizabethan model of vigilant, sleepless control to the rest of the world. The Great Indian Sleep Survey of the 1880s was a classic example of this imperial mindset. It was a vast, pseudo-scientific undertaking, designed to classify the subcontinent's myriad sleep cultures according to a rigid, hierarchical system. The martial races, such as the Sikhs and the Gurkhas, were deemed to have a vigilant and disciplined sleep pattern, making them suitable for recruitment into the colonial army. The effeminate and indolent peoples of Bengal, by contrast, were diagnosed with chronic tropical languor, a condition that supposedly rendered them unfit for self-government. The survey was, of course, a complete fiction, a projection of British prejudices onto a complex and diverse reality. But it was a fiction with real-world consequences, a fiction that was used to justify the continued subjugation of a continent. The proposed solution to the problem of Indian sleep was the mass importation of British flannel pajamas, a product that was believed to have almost magical, civilizing properties. The fact that they were entirely unsuitable for the Indian climate was a minor detail, easily overlooked in the grand, imperial scheme of things. The resistance to the industrial sleep regime took many forms. In the textile towns of the north, a clandestine network of nap-easies emerged. These were secret locations, a cellar, an attic, a disused warehouse, where exhausted factory workers could pay a few pennies to snatch an hour of uninterrupted sleep. They were the speakeasies of the slumber world, illegal havens of rest in a city that never slept. The circulation of seditious lullabies was another form of resistance. These were traditional nursery rhymes, rewritten with new, politically charged lyrics, lamenting the tyranny of the factory whistle and calling for a general strike of the sleepy. Rock-a-bye, baby, on the treetop, became rock-a-bye, baby, till the machines stop. These lullabies were sung in hushed tones in the darkened tenements, a quiet, desperate protest against a world that had forgotten the value of a good night's sleep. And so we arrive at the present day, the age of wellness, the age of the quantified self, the age where sleep has become the ultimate luxury good. The modern Briton is caught in a bizarre paradox. They are obsessed with sleep, yet seemingly incapable of it. They track their sleep with apps, they optimize it with gadgets, they discuss it with therapists. They have turned their bedrooms into high-tech sleep laboratories, filled with blackout blinds, white noise machines, and mattresses that cost more than a small car. They have embraced the language of sleep hygiene, a sterile, medicalized discourse that treats the night as a problem to be managed, a disease to be cured. But in all this frantic activity, this desperate search for the perfect night's sleep, they have lost sight of the simple, profound truth that their Celtic ancestors understood so well: that sleep is not a performance, not a commodity, not a problem. It is a gift, it is a journey, it is a mystery, and it is a mystery that cannot be solved with an app, or a gadget, or a pill. It is a mystery that can only be embraced, with humility, with patience, and with a willingness to let go, to surrender, to fall into the darkness, and to dream. And perhaps, one day, the people of the Insomniac Isles will learn to do that again. Perhaps, one day, they will finally find a comfortable position. But I wouldn't bet on it. After all, there's an election coming up, and a new series on Netflix. And the weather has been frightful. And, well, you know, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. And very, very British. Thus, the great wheel of slumber turns, and the history of the Somnolent Isles reveals itself not as a linear progression, but as a recurring, farcical cycle. The anxieties of one age are simply the rebranded neuroses of the next. The Roman administrator, sleepless over his tax returns, is the spiritual ancestor of the modern office worker, haunted by the phantom ping of an unread email. The Viking raider, with his strategic deployment of unsettling noises, has been reborn as the upstairs neighbor with a passion for late-night DIY. The Norman commissioner, meticulously cataloging the nation's snores, would surely have been a pioneer in the field of sleep-tracking apps, monetizing our REM cycles with ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency. The Tudor courtier, feigning wakefulness to curry favor with an insomniac monarch, is echoed in the junior executive, conspicuously answering emails at midnight. The imperialist, convinced of the moral superiority of his own bedtime, is alive and well in the wellness blogger, evangelizing the virtues of their own, highly specific, and deeply judgmental, sleep hygiene routine. History, it seems, does not repeat itself, but it does, quite often, snore in the same key. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental, underlying struggle, the eternal, unwinnable, and deeply British war against the simple, biological, necessity of rest, remains stubbornly and hilariously the same. The Isles slumber on, trapped in a dream of their own making, a dream from which they are always, just about, to wake up. But not just yet. Perhaps after one more cup of tea.